May 8, 1978. Sinisi, Sicily. A cramped room on the second floor of a building on Via Nazionale. The red light on the transmitter glows steady. A microphone sits between stacks of records. Newspaper clippings, handwritten notes scrawled with jokes, accusations, mockery. Giuseppe Peppino Impastato leans into the microphone. His voice, sharp, sardonic, fearless, cuts through the static and reaches into homes across this small town of 15,000 people, pressed between mountains and sea. He's talking about Tano Seduto, Sitting Tano, a thinly veiled reference to Gaetano Badalamenti, the most powerful mafia boss in western Sicily, a man who lives in the same neighborhood as the Impastato family, a man who has mafia associates strategically placed at Punta Raisi Airport, just kilometers away, allowing heroin shipments to move with reduced risk, a man who does not forgive insults. Tonight's broadcast is particularly biting. Peppino ridicules Badalamenti's business dealings, his political connections, his pretensions of respectability. He uses satire like a scalpel, cutting through the code of silence, omertà, that has protected Sicilian mafia bosses for generations. He makes people laugh at a man they've been taught to fear. In 24 hours, Peppino Impastato will be dead. His body will be found on railroad tracks torn apart by explosives, officially dismissed as a terrorist accident or suicide. The truth will take nearly a quarter century to emerge, that he was abducted, beaten, tied to those tracks, and murdered on the direct orders of the man he'd spent years mocking on the radio. This is the story of a young man who grew up surrounded by mafia culture. His father a low-level associate, his uncle by marriage a powerful boss, and chose to become its most dangerous enemy. Not with guns or bombs, but with something the mafia couldn't counter: a microphone, a transmitter, and the willingness to laugh in the face of death. In a town ruled by silence and fear, Peppino Impastato asked a question that would cost him everything. What happens when you refuse to be afraid? What happens when you speak the names everyone else whispers? What happens when you turn organized crime's greatest weapon, intimidation, into a punchline? The answer came on a dark stretch of railroad track on the night of May 9th, 1978. But before that night, there was a boy who couldn't accept that his hometown had to live in chains. January 5th, 1948. Sinisi, Sicily. A coastal town 30 kilometers west of Palermo, pressed against the Tyrrhenian Sea. Population, 15,000. Industries, fishing, agriculture, and, though never mentioned openly, organized crime. Giuseppe Impastato was born into a world where the mafia wasn't an abstract threat or a distant criminal organization. It was family. It was neighbors. It was the fabric of daily life. His father, Luigi Impastato, was connected, a low-level associate of the local Cosa Nostra family. Not a made man, not a boss, but someone who did favors, carried messages, kept his mouth shut. Someone who understood that in Sicily, survival meant knowing which men to respect and which questions never to ask. Peppino's uncle by marriage, Cesare Mancella, was something far more significant. Mancella was a mafia boss, a man of respect, a key figure in the Sinisi family. He controlled rackets, settled disputes, enforced the code. He was wealthy, feared, connected to the most powerful families in Sicily. The Impastato home sat on Via Selinunte, a quiet residential street. Just a short walk from the Impastato home lived another man, Gaetano Tano Badalamenti. Badalamenti was the boss of Sinisi, not just a criminal, a power broker, a shadow government, a man whose word carried more weight than any law. He'd risen through the ranks in the 1950s and 1960s, building an empire based on construction contracts, extortion, smuggling, and increasingly, heroin trafficking. By the 1970s, Badalamenti was one of the most powerful mafia figures in Sicily, a member of the Cupola, the Sicilian Mafia's ruling commission. He had cultivated strategic relationships at Punta Raisi Airport, the international airport serving Palermo. Through carefully placed mafia associates, airport workers, security personnel, customs officials, and baggage handlers, Badalamenti had created a network that allowed heroin shipments to move through the airport with reduced risk. Morphine base from Turkey and Lebanon arrived in Sicily, was refined into heroin in clandestine labs in the countryside, then shipped through the airport to New York, where the Gambino and Bonanno families distributed it across America. This was the pizza connection, a billion-dollar heroin pipeline that would eventually become one of the most significant international drug trafficking cases in history. And Gaetano Badalamenti sat at its center, in a house in the same neighborhood where Peppino Impastato grew up. Most children in Cinisi learned early not to ask questions, not to notice the expensive cars driven by men with no visible jobs, not to wonder why certain people were treated with exaggerated deference, not to mention the beatings, the disappearances, the businesses that burned down after owners refused to pay protection money. Peppino Impastato noticed everything. He was bright, curious, restless. He read voraciously newspapers, books, political theory. While other teenagers focused on soccer and courtship, Peppino consumed Marx, Gramsci, and anti-fascist literature. He was drawn to leftist politics, to the Italian Communist Party, to ideas about social justice and collective resistance against oppression. And increasingly, he was disgusted by what he saw in his own town. The contrast was unbearable. His family lived comfortably because of mafia connections. His uncle, by marriage, was a boss. His father accepted this as the natural order. You were born into certain families, you played certain roles, you didn't question the system. But Peppino questioned everything. In the late 1960s, as Peppino entered his 20s, the tension in the Impastato household intensified. Peppino began openly criticizing the Mafia. Not carefully, not diplomatically. Loudly, angrily, in arguments with his father that shook the house. Luigi Impastato was horrified and terrified. His son was violating the most fundamental rule of Sicilian life: silence. Omerta wasn't just about not talking to police. It was about not acknowledging the Mafia's existence at all. You didn't criticize, you didn't question, you certainly didn't do so where neighbors could hear. The breaking point came in 1963, when Cesare Manzella, Peppino's uncle by marriage, the family's mafia connection, was assassinated. A car bomb planted by rival factions during one of Sicily's periodic mafia wars. Manzella was blown apart, his body scattered across a country road. Most of the family mourned. Peppino felt something different, a clarifying anger. His uncle by marriage had been murdered by the same system he'd served. The mafia consumed its own, and everyone pretended this was normal, acceptable, even honorable. By the late 1960s, Peppino had made a decision that would define and ultimately end his life. He would fight the mafia. Not with violence. He was a communist, an activist, a believer in social change through political action. But he would fight with the only weapons he possessed: his voice, his intelligence, and his absolute refusal to be silent. To understand what Peppino Impastato chose to confront, you must understand Cinisi in the 1970s. On the surface, it was a typical Sicilian coastal town. Narrow streets lined with whitewashed buildings, a central piazza where old men played cards and drank espresso, churches with Baroque facades, fishing boats in the harbor, lemon groves and olive trees on the hillsides. Beneath the surface, suffocating control. Gaetano Badalamenti didn't rule through constant violence. He didn't need to. His power was atmospheric, omnipresent. Everyone knew who he was. Everyone knew what happened to people who crossed him. The fear was internalized, self-enforcing. Business owners paid protection money pizzo without being asked. They simply understood it was required. Construction companies gave Badalamenti-connected firms no-bid contracts. Politicians consulted him before making decisions. Police looked the other way or actively collaborated. The airport was his strategic asset. Punta Raisi handled flights to Rome, Milan, Paris, New York. It was small compared to major European airports. Badalamenti's network of Mafia associates positioned throughout the facility. Baggage handlers who could access restricted areas, customs officials who knew which bags not to inspect, security personnel who could create gaps in surveillance, allowed heroin to move through with significantly reduced risk of detection. Heroin moved through in suitcases and shipments mislabeled as legitimate cargo, in the luggage of unwitting travelers whose bags were switched during transit. The operation was sophisticated, profitable, and seemed untouchable. And everyone in Sinisi knew. They didn't know specifics, who was involved, how the system worked, where the drugs went. But they knew Badalamenti was rich, powerful, and connected to something far larger than local construction contracts. They just never said it out loud. Until Peppino Impastato got access to a radio transmitter. 1977. A small room in a building on Via Nazionale, Sinisi. Peppino Impastato and a handful of friends, activists, communists, students, artists, are building something unprecedented in Sicily, an independent radio station. They call it Radio Aut, short for Autonomia, Autonomy. A declaration of independence from official media, from censorship, from the suffocating silence that Badalamenti's power enforced. The technical aspects were challenging. Radio transmitters weren't cheap or legal. Italy's state broadcaster, RAI, held a monopoly on the airwaves. Operating an unauthorized station was illegal. But the equipment was becoming more accessible. Transistor technology, cheaper components, instructions available through activist networks. Peppino and his collaborators scraped together funds. They bought a transmitter, weak by commercial standards but powerful enough to reach Sinisi and surrounding towns. They installed it in a second-floor room, ran cables to a makeshift antenna, tested frequencies until they found one that worked. The station operated on a shoestring budget. No advertising revenue, no corporate sponsors, just volunteers working shifts, playing records, discussing politics, reading poetry, interviewing local activists, and increasingly mocking Gaetano Badalamenti. Peppino understood something crucial about power. It relies on fear, and fear relies on seriousness. Make power look ridiculous, and it weakens. He created a character for his broadcast, Tano Seduto, Sitting Tano, a play on Toro Seduto, the Italian name for Sitting Bull, the famous Lakota leader. But where Sitting Bull was a symbol of resistance and dignity, Tano Seduto was a buffoon, a petty tyrant, a criminal pretending to be a businessman. Peppino's broadcasts were devastating because they were funny. He didn't deliver dry denunciations of organized crime. He created elaborate satirical sketches. He used different voices, sound effects, musical cues. He made people laugh. And laughter was the one thing Badalamenti couldn't counter with intimidation. A typical broadcast might feature Peppino narrating the daily life of Tano Seduto, waking up in his house, checking on his business interests at the airport, meeting with his associates to discuss import-export operations. The language was coded enough to provide plausible deniability. Peppino never explicitly said Gaetano Badalamenti or heroin trafficking. but everyone in Cinisi knew exactly who and what he meant. He described construction contracts awarded without bidding, airport security inexplicably absent during certain shifts, mysterious wealth flowing to men with no visible employment, political officials making suspiciously convenient decisions. And he did it with withering, creative mockery. Tano Ceduto wasn't terrifying, he was pathetic. A small-time crook playing dress-up as a businessman, a thug with delusions of respectability. This was psychological warfare of the most dangerous kind. The Mafia's power rested on an image of invincibility, of respect that bordered on reverence. Peppino was destroying that image, replacing it with ridicule. What made Radio Art truly revolutionary wasn't just the mockery, it was the public nature of it. For generations, Sicilians had lived under omertà. The word translates roughly as code of silence, but it meant something deeper, a cultural prohibition against acknowledging the Mafia's existence. You didn't talk to police. You didn't testify in court. You didn't discuss crimes you'd witnessed. You didn't even admit in private conversation that the Mafia existed. This silence protected the Mafia more effectively than any weapon. It made investigation impossible. It prevented community organization. It isolated victims, making them feel alone in their suffering. Peppino shattered that silence. He talked about the Mafia constantly, explicitly, mockingly. He named operations, he described crimes, he connected dots that everyone could see, but no one would acknowledge. And crucially, he did it publicly, over the radio, where everyone could hear. This transformed the social dynamic. Individual Sicilians might be too afraid to speak, but when Radio Out broadcast, they were listening together. They heard Peppino's voice. They heard him laughing at Badalamenti. They heard him surviving another day, another broadcast. It created a space, limited, fragile, but real, where the Mafia could be discussed, criticized, resisted. The reaction in Cinisi was complex and divided. Some people, particularly younger residents, students, leftist activists, were electrified. Finally, someone was saying what everyone thought. Finally, the emperor had been revealed as wearing no clothes. They listened religiously. They repeated Peppino's jokes. They felt, for the first time, that resistance was possible. Others were terrified. They feared for Peppino's life. They feared retaliation against the community. They feared that breaking omertà would bring chaos, violence, destruction. Better to live under stable oppression than risk Badalamenti's wrath. Many felt both simultaneously, admiration and fear, hope and dread. Peppino's family was torn apart. His mother, Felicia, loved her son but feared for him constantly. His brother, Giovanni, supported him, but understood the danger. His father, Luigi, was horrified. His son was destroying everything Luigi had carefully built, every relationship he'd maintained, every protection the family enjoyed through Mafia connections. The arguments were bitter. Luigi begged Peppino to stop. Peppino refused. Eventually, Luigi disowned him. Peppino moved out, living with friends and fellow activists, completely estranged from his father. The Impastato family was fracturing along the same fault line that ran through Sicilian society, between accommodation and resistance, between silence and truth. Badalamenti's response was initially restrained. He didn't immediately order Peppino killed. This restraint had strategic logic. First, Peppino's broadcasts reached only a limited area. Radio Out was a small operation. It wasn't reaching national audiences or attracting major media attention. Killing Peppino might draw more attention than ignoring him. Second, Peppino's father had connections to the Mafia through his uncle by marriage. Killing Luigi Impastato's son would violate certain norms, create complications. Third, Badalamenti was busy. The heroin operation was expanding. The pizza connection was generating enormous profits. Internal mafia politics demanded attention. A loudmouth on a pirate radio station seemed like a minor irritation. But the threats began, subtle at first. Peppino would find his car tires slashed. Anonymous phone calls warned him to stop broadcasting. Men would stand outside Radio Out's building, watching, making their presence known. Friends and supporters received visits. Nothing explicit, just reminders. Your friend should be careful. These broadcasts could create problems. Some people don't appreciate being talked about. Peppino ignored every threat. If anything, they made him bolder. He increased the frequency of broadcasts. His mockery became sharper. He started providing more specific details about airport operations, about construction corruption, about political collusion. He was daring Badalamenti to act, and Badalamenti was calculating when, not if, to respond. Early 1978, Radio Out broadcasts are becoming more specific, more dangerous. Peppino isn't just mocking Tano Seduto anymore. He's describing actual operations. He talks about Punta Raisi Airport, not in vague terms, but with details. Specific security gaps, patterns in staffing, rumors about shipments moving through at night. Where is he getting this information? From workers at the airport, baggage handlers, cleaners, low-level employees who saw things, heard things, knew things, but had never had a way to report them safely. Peppino is creating a channel for these whispers, amplifying them into public accusations. He describes how certain flights received unusual attention, how particular luggage moved through restricted areas, how customs inspections became conveniently cursory for specific shipments. He never says heroin. He never needs to. Everyone understands what he's describing. This is exponentially more dangerous than general mockery. Badalamenti could tolerate being called names. He cannot tolerate someone threatening the airport operation, the Golden Goose, the billion-dollar pipeline. Peppino is also escalating his political activism. He's running for Sinisi Town Council as a member of Democracia Proletaria, Proletarian Democracy, a radical leftist party. His campaign is openly anti-Mafia, explicitly targeting Badalamenti's political connections. He holds rallies in the piazza, small crowds. Most people are too afraid to attend publicly, but symbolically important. He distributes flyers detailing corruption in local government, connections between elected officials and organized crime. He's not just broadcasting anymore, he's organizing, building a movement, creating political structures that could potentially challenge mafia control of local government. This is crossing a line. Mockery is one thing. Political opposition that could actually disrupt mafia control of institutions is something else entirely. By spring 1978, Peppino is living under constant stress. He knows he's in danger. Friends are urging him to leave Sicily, to move to Rome or Milan, where he'd be safer. Some suggest he should stop broadcasting, at least temporarily, let tensions cool. Peppino refuses. He's committed now past the point of return. Stopping would mean admitting that the mafia was right, that fear works, that silence is the only option, that power can't be challenged. He's also experiencing a kind of fatalism. He's 29 years old. He's made his choice. He understands the probable outcome. But he believes, deeply genuinely, that his death, if it comes, will mean something. That he's building something larger than himself. In conversations with close friends, he talks about the importance of breaking omerta, of showing that resistance is possible even in the heart of mafia territory. He believes that even if he's killed, others will follow, that the silence, once broken, can't be fully restored. He's right about that, but it won't help him survive. By May 1978, Gaetano Badalamenti has decided that Peppino Impastato must die. The calculation is strategic, not emotional. Badalamenti isn't personally offended by mockery. He's a businessman. But Peppino has become a threat to business. The airport operation is too valuable to risk. The political activism is creating potential complications. And most importantly, Peppino's continued survival is sending the wrong message. If one person can break omertà without consequences, others might follow. An example must be made, but it must be done carefully. Badalamenti doesn't want to create a martyr. He doesn't want national attention focused on Sinisi, on the airport, on his operations. So the murder is planned to look like something else. An accident. A terrorist attack gone wrong. Anything except a mafia execution. May 8th, 1978. Evening. Peppino records what will be his final broadcast. The usual mix of satire, political commentary, mockery. He signs off around midnight. He visits friends. They talk late into the night. Politics, the upcoming election, plans for future broadcasts. Around 3 a.m., Peppino says goodnight and heads home. He's walking alone through empty streets. Sinisi at night. Quiet, dark, most windows shuttered. Somewhere between his friend's house and his own, a car pulls alongside him. Men he probably recognizes, local mafia associates, possibly people he's seen around town his entire life. They tell him to get in. Whether they use weapons or just the implicit threat of violence, Peppino complies. The car drives out of town toward the railroad tracks that run between Sinisi and the airport. What happens next is reconstructed from forensic evidence, eventual testimony, and the physical scene investigators documented in the morning. Peppino is beaten. The evidence of trauma to his body confirmed he'd been assaulted before death. His captors wanted him subdued, wanted him to understand what was happening and why. They take him to a specific section of railway track, a curve relatively isolated where the Palermo-Trapani line passes through open countryside. They tie him to the tracks with wire, restraining him securely. They place explosives under and around his body. The amount and exact placement would later be documented by investigators, though the precise technical details varied in different accounts. What is certain? Enough explosive power to cause catastrophic damage, to scatter remains across a wide area, to make forensic identification difficult. The killers set the explosives to detonate, then leave. At approximately 4 a.m. on May 9, 1978, the explosives detonate. The blast is massive. Peppino's body is torn apart. Pieces are scattered across dozens of meters. The explosion damages the railway track, tears up surrounding vegetation, leaves a crater. Nearby residents hear the blast. Some think it's a train accident. Others suspect something worse, but say nothing. The timing of Peppino Impastato's murder was calculated with cold precision. May 9, 1978 was not a random date. That same morning, just hours after Peppino's murder, the body of Aldo Moro would be discovered in Rome. Aldo Moro was one of Italy's most prominent politicians, a former prime minister, president of the Christian Democracy Party, a key figure in Italian politics. He'd been kidnapped 55 days earlier by the Red Brigades, a leftist terrorist organization. His kidnapping had dominated Italian news for nearly 2 months. The entire nation was focused on his fate. On May 9th, the Red Brigades executed Moro, leaving his body in the trunk of a car in central Rome. This event, Moro's murder, was a national catastrophe. Every newspaper, every television station, every political conversation was focused on Rome. Italy was in shock, mourning political crisis. A young activist blown up on railroad tracks in a small Sicilian town? That barely registered. A few lines in regional newspapers, No national coverage, no political outrage. Badalamenti's timing had provided perfect cover. The murder would be buried beneath a far larger story. May 9th, 1978. Morning. Local police arrive at the scene on the railroad tracks. What they find: a massive blast crater, damaged railway line, human remains scattered across the area, and evidence of explosives. The obvious interpretation: someone was killed by explosives. Either a mafia execution or, given the political climate, the Red Brigade's ongoing terrorism campaign, the chaos of Moro's kidnapping, possibly a terrorist who accidentally detonated his own bomb. The police investigation from the beginning was compromised. Within hours, officials began pushing a narrative. Peppino Impastato had been a terrorist. The explosives were his own. He'd been preparing an attack, possibly against a nearby railway or airport, and accidentally killed himself. This narrative was absurd to anyone who knew Peppino. He was a radio host, an activist, a communist, but nonviolent. He'd spent years advocating for political and social change through democratic means. He'd never been connected to terrorism. His entire philosophy was based on using voice and media, not violence. But the narrative served multiple purposes. It deflected attention from the mafia. It discredited Peppino, turning a victim into a perpetrator. It made the death seem like justice, a terrorist killed by his own weapons. And it aligned with national anxieties about leftist terrorism during the years of lead. The investigation was perfunctory. No serious forensic analysis of the blast pattern. No investigation into Peppino's movements that night. No interviews with potential witnesses. No examination of threats he'd received. The case was quickly closed. Official cause of death: accidental suicide during terrorist activity. Peppino's family knew immediately that the official story was a lie. His brother Giovanni Impastato refused to accept the suicide accident narrative. He knew Peppino. He knew about the threats. He knew about Radio Out, about the mockery of Badalamenti, about the escalating danger. Giovanni became the center of a grassroots effort to uncover the truth. He contacted journalists. He organized local activists. He collected evidence, recordings of Peppino's broadcasts, documentation of threats, witness statements from people who'd seen suspicious activity. But in 1978, in Sicily, challenging an official police conclusion about a mafia murder was nearly impossible. The institutions were compromised. The press was intimidated. Potential witnesses were terrified. Giovanni and his mother, Felicia, began what would become a decades-long fight for justice. A fight that would require extraordinary persistence, political change, judicial courage, and finally, the testimony of someone from inside the mafia itself. For years after Peppino's murder, nothing happened. The case remained officially closed. Badalamenti continued operating. The heroin pipeline through Punta Raisi Airport continued. But several developments were slowly building toward eventual justice. First, the Pizza Connection investigation. In the early 1980s, American and Italian law enforcement agencies began coordinating a massive investigation into the transatlantic heroin trade. FBI agents, DEA agents, and Italian investigators tracked money, intercepted shipments, built cases against major trafficking networks. Gaetano Badalamenti was identified as a central figure. Not just a Sicilian boss, a key coordinator of international drug trafficking. By 1984, he was indicted in the United States on narcotics charges. Second, the Maxi trial. In 1986 to 1987, Sicily held the largest anti-Mafia trial in Italian history. 474 defendants, thousands of charges, a specially built courthouse bunker in Palermo. The trial was led by judges Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino, two magistrates who revolutionized anti-mafia prosecution. The Maxi trial relied heavily on testimony from Tommaso Buscetta, a high-ranking mafioso who became the first significant pentito, turncoat, breaking omerta to testify against the mafia. Buscetta's testimony exposed the mafia's organizational structure, its leadership, its operations. During this testimony, Buscetta mentioned Peppino Impastato's murder. Not in detail, Buscetta wasn't directly involved, but enough to confirm what everyone in Sicily already knew. Peppino had been murdered by the mafia on Badalamenti's orders, and the official story was a cover-up. Third, renewed judicial investigation. The push to reopen Peppino's case came primarily from Giovanni Impastato, public activists, and journalists who refused to let the case die. Their persistent advocacy, combined with the broader anti-mafia climate created by the Maxi trial, eventually led to judicial authorities reopening the investigation. While Judge Falcone's work in prosecuting the mafia helped create the institutional environment that made justice possible, the specific investigation into Peppino's murder was driven by multiple judicial figures working in response to public pressure. Reopening the investigation 2 decades after the murder presented enormous challenges. Physical evidence was gone. The crime scene had been thoroughly compromised. Potential witnesses had scattered, died, or remained too afraid to testify. The original investigators had destroyed or lost documentation. But prosecutors were persistent. They re-examined the forensic evidence that did exist. They interviewed Giovanni Impastato and other activists who'd known Peppino. They studied radio broadcasts. They documented the threats Peppino had received. Most crucially, they leveraged testimony from pentiti, former mafiosi who were cooperating with authorities. Beyond Buscetta, other turncoats provided pieces of the story. Not all had direct knowledge, but collectively, their testimony painted a clear picture. The investigation confirmed what Giovanni Impastato had argued for years. Peppino had been systematically threatened because of his radio broadcasts. Gaetano Badalamenti had ordered his murder. Local mafia associates had carried out the killing. The terrorist accident story was a deliberate cover-up involving corrupt officials. Gaetano Badalamenti never stood trial in Italy for Peppino's murder, not because of innocence, but because of timing. In 1984, Badalamenti was arrested in Spain as part of the Pizza Connection investigation. He was extradited to the United States, where he faced federal narcotics trafficking charges. The trial, United States versus Badalamenti et al., began in 1985 and lasted nearly 2 years, one of the longest criminal trials in American history. In 1987, Badalamenti was convicted and sentenced to 45 years in federal prison. He would die in prison in 2004, never having served time for Peppino's murder. But in Italy, the investigation continued. Other defendants, the men who'd actually carried out the killing, were identified and prosecuted. Vito Palazzolo, Gaetano Cina, and other mafia associates connected to the murder were eventually arrested. The trials were frustratingly slow. Witnesses recanted. Evidence was challenged. Defense attorneys exploited every procedural complexity. But gradually, convictions were secured. April 11, 2002, 24 years after Peppino Impastato's murder. An Italian court officially determined that Gaetano Badalamenti had ordered the killing. Vito Palazzolo was sentenced to 30 years for participating in the murder. Other associates received sentences. Giovanni Impastato, now in his 50s, had spent nearly a quarter-century fighting for this moment. His mother, Felicia, had died in 2004, shortly after seeing partial justice achieved. The conviction was simultaneously a triumph and a tragedy. Justice had been served, but it had taken 24 years. Badalamenti himself was in an American prison, beyond the reach of Italian authorities. Many of the perpetrators had lived free for decades. The institutional corruption that had enabled the cover-up was never fully addressed. But the case had achieved something beyond convictions. Peppino Impastato's story became a symbol of anti-Mafia resistance in Italy, particularly in Sicily. His life represented a fundamental truth, that individuals could resist even when institutions were compromised, that speaking truth had value even at the cost of life, that breaking omertà was the essential first step toward dismantling Mafia power. In 2000, Italian director Marco Tullio Giordana released I 100 Passi, The 100 Steps, a biographical film about Peppino's life. The title referred symbolically to the proximity between the Impastato family home and Badalamenti's house in the same neighborhood. The film won numerous awards, introduced Peppino's story to a national and international audience, and cemented his status as a martyr for anti-Mafia activism. Schools, streets, and community centers across Italy were named after him. His story was taught in classrooms as an example of civic courage. Annual commemorations were held in Tunisia on the anniversary of his death. Radio Out's legacy influenced later anti-Mafia media efforts. The idea that independent media could challenge organized crime, that satire and public exposure were weapons against corruption, these concepts became central to Italian anti-Mafia activism. Peppino Impastato's life poses uncomfortable questions about courage, sacrifice, and resistance. Was he right to continue broadcasting despite knowing the danger? Would stopping have been cowardice or prudence? Did his death achieve enough to justify the sacrifice? These questions have no simple answers, but his choice illuminated several truths. The power of public speech. Badalamenti killed Peppino not because the broadcasts materially damaged his operations, but because they damaged something more fundamental, the aura of invincibility. Peppino proved that power could be named, mocked, challenged. That demonstration was more dangerous than any police investigation. The necessity of breaking silence. Omertà was the Mafia's greatest defensive weapon. It prevented communities from organizing, from resisting collectively. Individual voices like Peppino's, even when silenced, created cracks in that wall of silence that eventually became structural failures. The cost of institutional failure. Peppino's murder succeeded not just because of Mafia violence, but because institutions, police, prosecutors, media were compromised. The cover-up was as significant as the murder itself. Reform required changing not just laws, but entire systems of power. The delayed arc of justice, 24 years from murder to conviction. A reminder that justice, even when eventually achieved, comes too late for the dead. But also a reminder that persistent activism, Giovanni Impastato's decades of advocacy, can eventually force even compromised systems to act. Today, Sinisi is different. Not transformed completely, the Mafia hasn't disappeared from Sicily, but changed. The airport operates under greater scrutiny. Anti-Mafia legislation has given prosecutors new tools. The culture of omertà, while not eliminated, has weakened. Young Sicilians grow up knowing Peppino's story, knowing that resistance is possible. Casa Memoria Felicia e Peppino Impastato, a memorial center in Sinisi, named for Peppino and his mother, serves as a museum, community center, and educational facility. It hosts school groups, researchers, activists. It preserves Radio Out's broadcasts, Peppino's writings, documentation of his activism. The center's existence is itself a victory. In a town once dominated by Gaetano Badalamenti, where silence was enforced through terror, there now stands a permanent institution dedicated to remembering a man who refused to be quiet. May 9th, 1978. Railroad tracks outside Cinisi. Peppino Impastato died tied to tracks, killed by explosives detonated by men who wanted to silence him forever. But his last broadcast still exists. You can still hear his voice, sharp, sardonic, fearless, mocking Tanno seduto, breaking omertà, proving that the Mafia could be challenged even in its heartland. The question Peppino asked, what happens when you refuse to be afraid, has an answer now. You might die, you might be silenced, at least temporarily. The powerful will try to erase you, to make your death meaningless, to restore the silence. But sometimes the silence can't be fully restored. Sometimes one voice is enough to show others that speaking is possible. Sometimes the murdered become more dangerous than they ever were alive, because their deaths reveal the desperation of the power they challenged. Gaetano Badalamenti died in prison. His network was dismantled. The pizza connection was broken. Punta Raisi Airport lost its value as a pipeline for heroin trafficking. The men who carried out Peppino's murder were convicted. None of this brings Peppino back. His family still mourns. The 24 years between murder and justice can't be reclaimed. The institutional corruption that enabled the cover-up was never fully purged. But in Cinisi today, school children learn about the young man who stood up to the Mafia. Streets bear his name. His broadcasts are preserved. His life is studied, honored, remembered. And in Sicily, in Italy, in any place where organized crime relies on silence and fear, Peppino Impastato's story endures as a reminder that courage doesn't require weapons, that resistance doesn't require armies, that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do to power is laugh at it, name it, refuse to grant it the fear it demands. They tied him to railroad tracks to teach a lesson about the price of defiance, the consequences of breaking omertà, the fate awaiting those who challenge the Mafia. But the lesson Peppino's life and death actually taught was different. That silence can be broken, that power can be named, that one voice matters. Even if that voice is silence, it can echo for decades, inspiring others to speak, to resist, to refuse the chains of fear. On May 9th, 1978, the Mafia killed Peppino Impastato. They've been trying to silence what he started ever since. They're still failing.